Welcome to Weathering Change Seminar Series. Today's speaker is Courtney Woods from the University of North Carolina, and she'll be talking about after the storm, debris management, and climate-driven disasters. And I'll turn it over to him. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation. So I wanted to start the talk by sharing a little bit about how I came to this work. This particular topic is not an area of work that I've engaged in until recently, but it's a really fascinating topic that I think is going to be of even greater significance as we continue to see more climate-related disasters. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about the origins of the environmental justice movement and how that is very closely related to the ways that we store and manage debris. And then I'll talk specifically about disaster debris, the means of managing it, what are some of the public health implications, and then talk specifically about a case example with Hurricane Helene, which hit North Carolina and other states in the Southeast in September 2024. So I am by training an engineer, toxicologist turned environmental health scientist. I've spent the last 10 years or so, actually 14 years, collaborating really closely with communities across North Carolina, examining a range of environmental health and environmental justice issues. I've spent quite a bit of time working with communities in the eastern part of the state that are impacted by hog operations and industrial animal operations. And then in the last decade, I've spent time working with a few communities that are impacted by landfills, both understanding generally the sort of quality of life issues in those communities and also examining some of the environmental and public health impacts with focus on understanding water quality. I would say the common thread of all of that work over the last decade and a half has been the keen interest in understanding how marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted by environmental exposures and health outcomes associated with exposure to environmental contaminants. And as a resident of North Carolina for the past 20 years, it's been an honor to collaborate with leaders who have been working on these issues since the birth of the EJ movement. Many of you may not know that North Carolina is the birthplace of the environmental justice movement, which got its start in the late 70s, early 80s in Warrenton, North Carolina. There were PCB contaminated soils that were dug up and slated to be stored in a landfill or landfill created in this town, which was 98+% African American. There was a lot of sort of resistance and civil unrest associated with this particular proposed siting. And residents, as well as folks from around the country, came to this particular location to protest, including some direct action, lying in the streets to prevent trucks from delivering the PCB contaminated soils. Ultimately, the landfill was sited there, and about a decade after its siting, there was discovery that the landfill did in fact fail and leach contamination into groundwater and surrounding environment. And the waste was dug up and taken to another location. Around the same time as the Warren County protests in this event was occurring, there was also work happening in Houston, Texas by Robert Bullard, who is considered the father of the EJ movement. And he was sociology, I guess PhD at the time, collaborating with his wife, who was a lawyer, who was trying a case against the city's waste management. And through his work, they discovered that Houston's general population, African American population, was about 20 to 25% of the city's population. But predominantly African American communities were responsible for hosting 3 of the 4 privately owned landfills in the city, as well as 6 of the 8 city-owned incinerators. And so again, this particular issue raised concerns that there was a disproportionate burden on communities of color in terms of hosting waste for the city. There were subsequent studies done by the U.S. GAO to understand toxic waste and race across the country, which also noted disproportionate siting, particularly in the southeast, of waste treatment, disposal, storage facilities, including landfills. And then work conducted in North Carolina at UNC examined landfills and solid waste facilities in the state. This work was conducted in 2000. Again, showing if you look at the odds ratios here and go across the table, you'll see for each grouping of the median household values, there's a significant increase as the community's proportion of people of color increases, so an increase in the odds ratio, as well as if we look at the going down median household value, we see an increase in the likelihood that the neighborhood is hosting a solid waste facility. So this work demonstrated that both race and wealth contributed, and additional work from this study revealed that rurality played an important role in whether or not a community was hosting a solid waste facility. Fast forward to 2017. I was already collaborating with folks in Eastern North Carolina on work related to industrial hog operations and understanding some of the health impacts there. And residents who live in a county, Sampson County, which also bears the burden of having the second highest density of hogs. This county also hosts the state's largest landfill. In particular, this landfill has been there since 1970s, was expanded in the 90s. The landfill receives about 5,000 tons of waste per day from about 250 20-ton trucks. And this happens every day a week except Sunday. So there's the sort of noise pollution, traffic associated with these facilities, significant severe odors from the facility, as well as emissions that may be less perceptible to residents. But this landfill is the second largest emitter of methane in the country, the second largest emitter of vinyl chloride, which is a carcinogen, liver carcinogen, And our work also discovered, well, we learned that perfluoroalkyl substances were being disposed of at this particular landfill, but our work also revealed that PFAS was likely um, leaving the facility and entering the surrounding environments. So my encounters with community members who were concerned about this facility resulted in us being invited there to conduct some sort of qualitative work to understand what sort of general environmental concerns the residents had. We conducted photo voice research that uncovered concerns in terms of odors and turkey vultures and other vermin that were attracted to their homes because of their proximity to the landfill. We learned about water quality concerns, mistrust of local officials, as well as sort of cost burden on residents because they were purchasing alternative sources of water. This work led us to conduct environmental monitoring near the landfill. As I just mentioned, our work uncovered migration of both legacy and novel PFAS, which some of the legacy PFAS are associated with household contaminants that might be disposed of in a landfill. And we observed migration uh, of those contaminants in surface waters, both near the Sampson County landfill as well as the Orange County landfill, which is near our university in Chapel Hill. These novel PFAS, which were associated with industrial sludge that was disposed of at the Sampson County landfill, we just only discovered those in the surface waters near the Sampson County landfill. I promise I'm getting to disaster debris very soon. And then finally, our work, the surface water work led us to conduct well water testing, in which we expanded across the county, but in particular observed elevated levels of PFAS in several groundwater wells near the landfill. And this work was in very close collaboration with community partner EJ Can, which is in Sampson County. And that work has prompted legal action, a consent decree, and agreement from the landfill in partnership with a neighboring community organization for some community benefits, among other things, including plans for decreasing PFAS in their leachate, among other things. So all of this work has really inspired me to better understand what some of the both environmental impacts of landfills are, as well as understanding some of the public health impacts and quality of life impacts of residents that live nearby. We've done work as well to identify other communities across the state that are siting or hosting landfills to understand what the sociodemographics of those neighborhoods and communities are. And that work is ongoing. So when we think about solid waste management in the most of my work has been in the US as it relates to this particular topic, but solid waste management, as you might imagine, every country has to figure out what to do with their waste. Countries that have a lot of lands, open land space will potentially plan to landfill it. Other countries like Japan might incinerate it. But in many cases, particularly in low-income countries, solid waste management is a pretty significant portion of their budget. But it's also can be a really important investment for municipalities because it has really important public health benefits. You also may not know that landfills are an important contributor to methane emissions and ultimately climate change. So municipal solid waste landfills account for approximately 15% of methane emissions. This number is a little outdated, but more recent numbers that I've seen show similar contributions. And when we're thinking specifically about debris that's generated from disasters, disaster debris, once it's taken from a household or from sites where the debris is located, it's ultimately stored in a landfill. Those The landfill storage there contributes to methane emissions, which contribute to intense climate-related storms. And those storms may, lead to subsequent disasters that will generate more disaster debris. So there's this sort of um, cycle that happens here with disaster debris. So, as the name implies, disaster debris is any sort of refuse or waste that's generated following a natural disaster or climate-related disaster. We might even think of disaster debris from war or other sort of man-made events. It can include infrastructure, natural materials, and everyday items that are in use. Because of the unexpected nature of disasters, this sort of creates a challenge. We're often not prepared to deal with such a sort of significant amount of debris at one time. And the scale of the event often results in generation that exceeds the normal annual waste generation, if we're thinking about waste that is ultimately fated for a landfill. The waste from debris from disasters can significantly shorten the life of those landfills because it's such a huge volume. We'll talk a little bit about the composition in a minute, but as you might imagine, there's vegetation and building materials. Depending on the type of disaster, I'm going to focus mainly on hurricanes and flooding events, but for fires, for example, there may be a lot of ash and toxic metals and burned batteries. So the nature and content of that debris can be pretty complex. And then also just as you, it might not be clear, but I'm focusing on solid waste debris as opposed to thinking about like contaminated water, which is also a really important um, waste that's generated from hurricanes and flooding in particular. So just thinking about the sheer volume in comparison to waste streams that are generated on a regular basis in the US throughout the year, our everyday household trash, which is referred to as municipal solid waste, can be anywhere from 290 million tons a year. Construction and demolition waste, we generate about 600 million tons a year. And then disaster debris, I'm listing two disasters here. So Hurricane Katrina, which is about 20 years ago now, generated about 100, as much as 100 million tons. Again, this is from one event. So comparing that to 600 million tons of C&D waste over an entire year, you can see this is a very significant amount of waste, and 2.5 million for Hurricane Maria, which hit Puerto Rico. So just some additional images. This first is from I said that I was going to focus on hurricanes and floods, but I did include an image here from the wildfires in the Palisades. So, you can think of wildfires as a sort of as a disaster as well that would generate a significant amount of debris. The image in the middle is an image from Hurricane Helene in North Carolina. So in addition to sort of piles of waste on the side of the road, we might also have a lot of waste floating in surface waters that needs to be removed. And then because I do a lot of work in Eastern North Carolina, where the two highest density counties for industrial hog operations as well as poultry production are, this is not an uncommon occurrence to see that hog houses are flooded. This is also a region of the state. It's sort of coastal, in the coastal region of the state, and so it is prone to flooding and hurricanes. And so that image shows dead pigs floating in in the surrounding surface waters. So there are lots of challenges with disaster debris. Some of that includes staging and figuring out where you're gonna, put these materials until they can be permanently stored in a landfill. Um, Accessing that material safely as well as separating it so that it again can get to the right landfill or the right location. It can be a challenge. Also preventing environmental contamination. In some cases, the materials need to be decontaminated depending on, what sorts of chemicals or radiological agents might have come in contact with the materials. There's a heavy cost associated with that management, which I'll talk about in a second. And then you might imagine the emotional toll that disasters in general take. We've, spoken to many hurricane survivors who get really shaken up and anxious even when a heavy rain comes. But you can imagine the emotional toll that it takes to see all of your belongings on the sidewalk in front of your house, or to see your entire house on the you know, uh, flattered to the ground behind you and just being in the midst of rubble. So the sort of visual of the debris we've heard can sort of trigger some significant emotional responses. So in terms of managing disaster debris, FEMA plays a pretty significant role in coordinating other federal agencies as well as state agencies and facilitating reimbursement for debris removal through public assistance programs. They also work with state agencies to employ contractors who are responsible for debris removal. We might, think of much of this work of recovering from a disaster to include rebuilding roads and bridges and schools and dealing with some of the immediate health and other emergency related issues. But debris management and removal can account for as much as 50% of funds that FEMA is distributing. At the household level, FEMA provides some guidelines for private residents to separate their waste, where it should be located on the site, how ensuring that it's, that they're not close to downed electric lines and those sorts of things, and that they're safe distance from roadways. And they also do offer some guidelines for how to safely separate and sort of personal protective equipment that residents should use as they're managing their waste. They also do have in North Carolina, they had a PPPDR, so it was like a private property debris removal program. So if residents cannot or do not want to sort of do that work themselves, they have some reimbursement programs. It is worth noting, there's a lot of caution from FEMA and other agencies to warn residents that scammers are common during the following disasters, in particular for debris removal. And so they offer some guidelines to residents to ensure that they're contracting with a legitimate agency or company or organization for debris removal. So there's, in terms of preparing for storms, we might not imagine that preparing for the rubble that is potentially to follow is one of the things that is prepared, is a part of the planning process. But local agencies, if they are planning well, they do plan for this in advance. So they have some identified sites already in mind, as well as some potential contract organizations to contract with. And just, planning this in advance can save time as well as space and ensure that the debris volume is managed appropriately. It helps to minimize the toxicity of the debris. And it also helps to ensure that there are the appropriate number of, transporters who can transport the debris appropriate. Ensuring that the staged areas are also sited in areas where there are sort of clear transportation routes as well. Ideally, they're looking for large parcels, large open parcels, so anywhere from 10 to 100 plus acres. Hopefully close to impacted neighborhoods. I don't have a map to share with you, but for the Hurricane Helene example, one map that I saw had, spotted throughout the western part of the state several sites for temporary waste management and storage. Some examples of sites that have been used in the past that are sort of common in areas and may be appropriate include fairgrounds, closed landfills, airports, parking lots, and public works areas, but ideally large open areas that have good drainage. You want to make sure that it's not close to wetlands or floodplains. You want to make sure there's stable soil. You want to aim to have minimal impacts on groundwater and nearby wells. And you also want that the location to be accessible to heavy trucks and near major roadways. And then following the storm, there may be a need for, grading the area. If the site isn't ideal in certain ways, there can be ways to make it more ideal. For example, grading. It's rare that these sites are lined. So for a modern day sort of sanitary landfill, these landfills are lined both with a clay lining and then with it's not completely impervious, but when it's initially installed, it's impervious, sort of plastic lining that prevents the landfill leachate from entering into the groundwater. So this sort of lining is not often placed at these temporary sites. The presumption is that these sites will not serve as permanent storage sites for waste. That said, that means that, there is potential for contamination of groundwater. There's potential for runoff into surface waters. Often there is the potential or opportunity to put some stormwater controls around the sites, as well as some fencing, at least to provide some security. And then one thing to sort of after the storm, well, I've said before and after the storm, but especially after the storm, there have been more recently some considerations of cumulative impacts in terms of the communities that are identified to host these sites. Just briefly, I'll talk a little bit about cumulative impacts. So we think of the US EPA defines it as the totality of exposures to both chemical and non-chemical stressors that might impact health, well-being, and quality of life. And so thinking about the references to environmental justice that I mentioned before, communities that are in rural areas or low income or communities of color, there's a wealth of research and literature to demonstrate that they're often overburdened by particular types of unwanted land uses, including landfills. And that's from there's a history of racial residential segregation, discriminatory zoning policies, among other political drivers that contribute to that. So that's just with the environmental exposures. If we think about cumulative exposures, there's also social stressors that contribute that can exacerbate health effects of environmental exposures. There's often, disproportionate impact of those social burdens as well. And so there are many policy makers, agencies, and researchers who are advocating for considerations of cumulative impacts in decision making. And certainly I'm advocating for that to play an important role in thinking about where disaster debris sites are cited. There are a couple of tools that can be useful for that. There's certainly at the federal level, the CDC has an environmental justice index, which allows you to visualize particular census blocks that have they created a environmental justice index, which encompasses both exposure, health outcomes, and social vulnerabilities. And then in North Carolina, we have a tool. This screenshot is at the county level, but we have data in this tool that also goes down to the block level to understand both environmental, social, and health vulnerabilities of communities. So these sorts of tools certainly should be used as decision makers, local and federal, state agencies are thinking about where to stage waste, disaster waste. All right, I'll talk briefly about Hurricane Helene, and then talk a little bit about sort of what's to follow that our group is working on. So this case example highlights Hurricane Helene, which, as I mentioned before, hit North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, and Virginia in September 2024. Hundreds of fatalities. It's considered the deadliest mainland U.S. hurricane since Hurricane Katrina. There was devastating flooding in the western part of North Carolina. This part of the state, which you can see, North Carolina is the sort of state in the middle, that whole red region on the left, had previously been considered a climate haven. So, it's far from the coast, had not prior to Hurricane Helene been impacted by any sort of significant flooding or hurricanes. And so many perceive this as a place that folks could, seek refuge to following storms. And so obviously it came as a shock to residents as well as agencies in the state to see this level of devastation in the region. To date, it's been up to $80 million in damages. And in addition to infrastructure damage, FEMA has also contributed a significant amount to debris removal. Just showing some images that were taken from folks' social media posts. So on the left is an image in the Asheville area. You can see this particular highway. This is a part of the Blue Ridge Parkway before the storm, and then following the storm, so completely inundated. There's several cities. I think Chimney Rock may be one of the worst, but I have yet to travel extensively throughout the region since the storm, so I can't say this is the worst, but it's certainly one of the worst, where you have, burgeoning town before the storm that's completely flattened following the storm. There's a lot of information here, but I want to draw your attention to the image of North Carolina State, sort of in the middle left side of the infographic that shows the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers role in debris removal. I believe this was posted sometime near the end of last year, where they're showing that they've helped remove 9 million cubic yards of waste, so the equivalent of 6 super container ships. They also have contributed significantly to waterway debris removal. So about 2/3 of that is from waterways, and a third of that from right-of-way, also contributing significantly to removal at properties, private properties. In terms of some of the environmental justice issues that we've observed or heard of arising following the storm. So this part of the state is a pretty rural part of the state. Asheville's there, Boone, probably the largest cities in the area. So as you might imagine, predominantly rural residents on private wells with these aren't major highways that are running through their towns. So just the ability to get to the areas to remove debris was challenging. I think some of the staging sites were located in valley, or a lot of the debris rather ended up in the valleys, which were challenging to reach. Many of the small rural counties report spending tens of millions on debris removal, but only a small fraction of that was reimbursed. Our EJ clinic here at UNC was informed of some concerns from Asheville public housing community residents, whose community was being proposed for temporary staging of toxic waste. It was later, the plans were later canceled and they chose another location, but this was a pretty significant concern. As you might imagine, these are residents on a budget, lower income, very concerned about the exposures that might result from being in such proximity to toxic waste. There were also residents in this case, but I've also heard, these reports from Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence, which hit North Carolina in 2014 and 2016, I believe, that many residents experienced significant delays in debris pickup. As you might imagine, in more remote areas, this time was longer. So the more remote rural areas, in previous hurricanes, previous ones that I mentioned, many of the residents who were in communities of color who had also cited challenges with, getting reimbursement from FEMA and figuring out the process of engaging with FEMA, reported some of these longer debris pickup times. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, this concern about the ultimate fate of the waste going to landfills that are already sited in lower income communities and rural communities, which both, shortens the lifespan of those landfills. Landfills are also usually not sort of designed in a way to manage that such a bolus of waste at one time. And so just thinking about the process of designing each new cell, and the uh, rapid nature in which that has to happen when you're dealing with this amount of waste, is an important consideration. So our team here has been, we've been working on a lit review related to disaster debris and, health inequities, environmental justice, and thinking about some of the justice implications of disaster debris. We've been working on that for at least a year now. We, in relation to Hurricane Helene, have also been assessing some of the maps of where these temporary waste storage sites are located and correlating that to the data that we have both from the Environmental Justice Index and some other indices that are connected to social vulnerability and existing environmental exposures. We're also trying to uncover where the fate of this waste was. So examining some of the reports on the Department of Environmental Quality site to understand where the waste ultimately lives. And then we also have some team members who are doing qualitative research to understand residents' experiences with disaster debris at their homes and in the county. With that, I will close and open up for questions that I can hopefully answer. Again, this is a topic that we are still very much in the initial phases of working on.
Please raise your hand and open your mic and come on in and ask a question. Go ahead, Art.
So, Dr. Woods or Courtney, I would say this was very specific and really interesting for those of us who had nothing whatsoever to do with this. I found it very enlightening because it's kind of a mystery otherwise in terms of what, we know that all these people are suffering and having a difficult time. You hear on the news that FEMA may be slow, but I never really thought about the state, after the safety of individuals and the event, then this cleanup is next step, like in this, and before people can rebuild. And you mentioned the role of FEMA in this several times, but there's concern now about what's happening with FEMA, right? And whether things are getting worse. I guess I'm trying to formulate exactly what I'm wanting to know here, but I think one is like, what is happening with FEMA now? And what would you say in general has been the FEMA experience that you are aware of for residents, and particularly in regard to environmental justice and people of color?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I'd say, in terms of the experience related to disaster debris removal, I don't have as much anecdotal evidence of, what FEMA's contributions have been beyond, what I reported in the presentation here. I have worked with residents in previous hurricanes, Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Florence, which hit the eastern part of the state. And I think one of the common reports that residents raised was just the challenge in navigating the process for reimbursement. This is for, if it's mold remediation in their homes or roof repair, there's often, significant damage to roofs and other residential infrastructure, but often if one of the most cost prohibitive repairs on homes are to roofs. And residents report just not being able to navigate the process, not knowing what forms they need to fill out, who it needs to go to. There are lots of organizations that do pop up, as well as some that I can think of in Eastern North Carolina that have been there for a while to support residents in navigating the process of reimbursement, but it's not an easy one. And then to think, just the divestment and some of the public agencies that we're seeing in recent years, I think will exacerbate the experience that residents are having. It means there's, potentially less money. It means, there may be greater challenges for states um, to receive, receive the funding from federal agencies to support them with the disasters. So
Thank
I
you.
think, I think that's a long way of saying I don't know that things are going to get better.
A couple from the chat. You mentioned storage of toxic waste dumping as an environmental justice issue. In your experience, what are the sources of this toxic waste? Are these chemical wastes, if so, what are the most frequent origin of these wastes?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I would say, so a lot of my work has been focused on municipal solid waste, landfills, and construction and demolition landfills. Presumably, there's not a lot of toxic stuff going into, your everyday household waste, household landfills. That said, again, many of the products that we use on a daily basis have perfluoroalkyl substances in them. This is sort of at a national level, a pretty significant concern in terms of landfill leachate being a source of PFAS contamination in the surrounding environment. And, leachate is sent to wastewater treatment plants. There's a whole sort of cycle of exposure that includes landfills. They're also, in North Carolina, but also in many other parts of the country, there are coal burning power plants, and some of that waste is disposed of in landfills. There's presumably, you're not supposed to throw away batteries in a regular landfill. So there are more hazardous material landfills where there are more precautions taken to ensure that contaminants aren't leaching into the natural environment. But I would say, in terms of what might be an issue in your area, you might want to consider what sort of industrial facilities are there, and where that industrial waste is going. So we have a couple of facilities here that generate that are producers of PFAS. Creosote is also something that we've historically had some issues with that are landfilled as well. All right, I see lots of other questions popping up, so I'll try to be shorter with my response.
Many state emergency managers that I have worked with have debris management plans, but these plans often don't factor in secondary storm impacts. Have you ever encountered any practical recommendations for stabilizing debris piles that might be hit by subsequent windstorms, flooding events, landslides, etc.?
Yeah, that's another great question that I didn't include here. And because of the duration for which these, waste piles can be staged at either in front of people's homes or at these temporary sites, it's an important consideration. I know that, if they have some time, they do try to this is not their residences, but at the temporary sites, they do try to put up some barriers to, if there are winds or something like that, it can help prevent. But if another, heavy or flooding event follows, then it certainly can contribute to secondary effects.
Okay, I have a question, which might lead to a second of my questions. But my first question is any of your group, are they, anyone there working or evaluating the workers and the risk factors, both ergonomic, aerosols with the black mold, or any of that within your group that will be dealing with this waste?
Not in my group, but this is an extremely important consideration. So the safety of, the folks who are having to remove the waste. We do have a OSHRC, Occupational Health and Environmental Research Center at UNC, and I know that they've done some work that's focused on those sort of occupational exposures for first responders and as well as folks who are removing debris and engaged in that work.
Okay. Anyone else have any other questions? If not, thank you very much. I found this to be a fascinating topic, and I'm really glad that we were able to have you come speak.